Hello, yeah, my name is Woon Jung. I'm the co-founder and CTO of Clumio, and today I have Mark Sider from LexisNexis. Mark, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Mark Sider. I'm at LexisNexis. I'm a senior consulting software engineer.
All right. So as for a quick agenda, what I'll be doing today is that I'll cover about why S3 backup is needed. And then Mark is going to cover a little bit about LexisNexis architecture, as well as some of the data resiliency challenges in their data lake. And then we'll go over a very high-level overview of Clumio's architecture and some of the cool innovations that we actually worked together over the last year. OK, so let's start about talking about why backing up S3 is important. It's actually beyond just S3, but it actually applies to every single data services that contains business-critical data. So when it comes to data resiliency, it's actually a shared responsibility model. Like AWS will guarantee the infrastructure resiliency. They'll make sure that your compute and network are in place. But when it comes to data resiliency, it's actually your challenge to actually go ahead and solve. Because if you think about it, when it comes to a delete event, let's say somebody calls something like a S3 delete object. From AWS standpoint, they have no way for them to tell whether that delete is legitimate or whether it is accidental or it's an attack. For them, a delete is delete. Therefore, it is your responsibility to actually go ahead and protect that data. We talked to a bunch of customers, and there's basically multiple reasons why people go ahead and back up their data in S3. The first one is about operational recovery. Obviously, these are accidental deletions that could happen, let's say, by having the wrong lifecycle rule in a bucket that could actually end up deleting the entire bucket or a subset of the bucket. The other reasons are things like cyber attacks that happens to be that talked about more and more these days. And lastly, it's about compliance requirement. There's different compliance requirements that enforces for you to have backup of your business critical data. Next, I'm going to pass it down to Mark.
Thank you. So I work at LexisNexis, the legal and professional division. A little about Lexis. It's a global provider of legal, regulatory, and business information. That's actually one of the world's largest online databases. We have about 144 billion records, and we're adding about 1.2 million new records every day. So with that challenge, my team is responsible for the data lake that houses most of this content at LexisNexis. So here's a high-level architectural diagram of our data lake. One of the things you might notice is that there's no VPC. So we're a completely serverless architecture. We don't even actually have a VPC in our AWS account. This provides us high scalability to meet the needs of the content coming in, because a lot of times we get big spikes of content. We actually load about 6 to 12 million new documents every hour. So we have a high rate of change. The documents are quite small, typically. They're about 35 kilobytes on average. We're a completely RESTful service, so that allows for a company, you don't have to be in Amazon to use us. And one of the benefits we use is we use AWS CloudFront to front it for low resilience endpoints. And we use a feature called origin groups. So origin groups provide the capability to fail over on a per request basis. And this provides us our DR resilience solution so that if we ever get a request that fails going to the primary bucket, we have all the data replicated between two AWS regions. It'll automatically fail over to the second bucket. And this is kind of important when we talk later about Clumio and instant access. So when we started looking at our backup requirements, we already had our DR capabilities handled through CloudFront, origin groups, and replicating the data between S3. But one of the problems we didn't have was what happens if somebody accidentally deletes the data, what if someone gets into the account and ransomwares it, what if a code bug happens that we didn't expect. So we needed to make sure that we had backups of this data that were immutable and air-gapped. So we wanted to make sure that even a super admin at the company has no way to touch, modify, delete, or encrypt any of the data. We also had low RPO, so 15-minute RPO requirement, because again, we're loading between 6 and 10 million documents every hour. So we need to make sure that we had low RPOs so we don't lose data. And then we also wanted to make sure that we had a low RTO to recover the data, because again, we're a very large database, and anytime you're out for more than a couple hours, revenue starts to take a hit. So as we started looking at vendors and what we could do in the space, we realized that we had some challenges. Mostly our challenges were around what we do and how we do it. So we have about 26 billion records in a single S3 bucket. We actually have about 800 terabytes of data, and we're loading between 6 and 12 million objects an hour. So we have a very high data rate change. And again, the average object size is 35 kilobytes, so it's very small. So we have a lot of very small files. And we also have, these are the 6 to 12 million new objects per hour, just the new ones. It doesn't account for any of the deletes that we have, where we either lose access to content or versions roll off because we only keep so many versions. So it's really, we have another 5 to 10 million requests per hour also hitting our S3 storage. When we looked at what we could do to repopulate from our vendors, it was going to take 6 months, which obviously was not an acceptable solution. So we started looking at different vendors to see what could solve this challenge, and that's where we came up with Clumio.
All right, thank you. So let's start with a high-level overview of the architecture and then start diving down deeper into the innovations that we actually work together. So I'm going to start with on the left-hand side or the right-hand side, depending where you are. This is kind of the customer account. In this example, that will be LexisNexis AWS account, and that bucket in the middle happens to be the bucket that we actually have to go and protect. The onboarding process is pretty straightforward. We actually provide you with a CloudFormation template or a Terraform script that you would actually go ahead and install it in your environment. Obviously, every environment is a little unique, so we also allow you to actually customize those templates and install it in your environment. Once that template is installed, what we go ahead and do is that we install all the assets that is required for Clumio to access your data and perform the backup. For example, we actually go ahead and create that IAM role in your account, and that is the IAM role that we assume in your account to actually carry out the backup processes. Along with that, we actually also install things like S3 inventory as well as S3 event bridge. These are the mechanisms by which we actually get the full list of objects that we actually go ahead and need to back it up. So the S3 inventory will give us the full list, while the S3 event bridge will actually give us the changes that are happening in your account, all the puts and deletes that are happening in your bucket, minute by minute. And that's the actual mechanism that we use to build the continuous backup or to deliver the 15-minute RPO. Once that is set up, on the right-hand side, we actually go ahead and create a dedicated AWS account for that specific customer. Think of that being more of a bunker account that we actually create for that one customer. And that, in this example, that account will be dedicated for LexisNexis, and that is the account where we actually house the data and process all that data. All that processing and then retention of the data happens on that dedicated account that is actually managed by Clumio. And everything on the right-hand side that happens on that dedicated account is purely serverless. Everything is Lambda-driven. And then everything dynamically scales up and down depending on the workload that we actually get. Like Mark mentioned, they're actually doing 10 million puts every hour on that bucket. So what that entails is that going to be 10 million events that happens to that event bridge. And whereas 10 million events happen, then we actually fired a bunch of Lambda functions that handles all that load. So basically, we want the backup to actually scale with the primary, because otherwise, the backup happens to be the bottleneck. Right? All right. Next, I'm going to talk about the work that I've been working with Mark and team over the last year. So it's about instant access. So what I'm going to start doing is, first of all, let me explain the basic restore process. When it comes to restore process, something clearly bad has happened in your account or in your bucket. So you're coming to me, and then you're telling me, hey, I want to restore this bucket to a specific point in time. Let's say yesterday at 5 p.m. I want to take that bucket as of yesterday 5 p.m. So the process goes as follows. First of all, we need to find out what are the objects that are visible at yesterday 5 p.m. So we need that list of objects, because obviously the objects changes, but what you're asking me is to restore it back to yesterday at 5 p.m. So first we actually do the query so that we know the list of objects that are visible. And then the second step is to actually go ahead for us to actually copy those objects back to the final destinations where you want to restore it to. However, if you think about it, the process of copying actually takes time, because we are actually moving bits from one location to the other. So in the case of LexisNexis, if they have 30 billion of objects, it will take days to actually go ahead and restore it. But we wanted to improve the RTO. We wanted to offer an RTO that is significantly faster than days. We wanted to do it in hours if it is possible. So what we ended up doing is implementing something called instant access. The first part of the restore still remains the same. So if you're coming to me and you're asking me, hey, I want to restore it back to yesterday at 5 p.m., we'll still go ahead and do the query and get the list of objects that is visible as of yesterday at 5 p.m. But the only difference is that this time, we're not going to copy those objects back to the final destination. But what we're going to go is stood up an S3 access point, S3 Lambda integration, basically. That endpoint starts behaving like an S3 endpoint that you can actually connect, and your application can actually start using that endpoint directly without copying all the bits into your final destination. While all this happened, we can hydrate it back to the final destination that you wanted. But this capability allows you to get up and running within hours, within days, while the restore happens. And that endpoint is what starts behaving like any other S3 endpoint. Mark, you want to talk about the integration?
Yeah, sure. So this was what was novel for us and innovative, because what it did was, again, we use origin groups with CloudFront. So it allowed us now to have our primary origin, rather than be our S3 bucket, which is no longer there, compromised, whatever may happen. We can now point to the backup that we had in Clumio, the instant access endpoint, and it provides immediate access, read access to all of that content. And actually, we were able to test that we were able to restore the 26 billion records in 2 hours and 48 minutes, which is awesome for our business, because now we're able to get to our critical data quickly, while at the same time, at the bottom, you can see we're rehydrating the data. So we have a failover back to what will be our primary origin. And at some point in the future, we now don't have to read from Clumio anymore. We can switch around our origin groups behind the scenes. Our customers don't know anything different, and now we're actually getting the data from our bucket. So this was what really kind of set Clumio apart for when we were looking at how to recover the data, not just from the backup perspective.
Right. So yeah, the onboarding process, like I mentioned, is pretty straightforward. It's just a Terraform template or a CloudFormation template. In 15 minutes, you're up and going, and just apply the policy at the bucket level, and you configure things like continuous backup, and then the whole thing flows. But do you want to spend a little bit of time kind of explain towards the results?
Yeah, so it was very easy to set up. They do have one-click integration in the console when we started working with them. However, we also had requirements that we weren't able to use that. We didn't want anyone to be able to modify our buckets in production outside of IAC. So we actually had to work with Clumio, and they were able to make some changes that allowed us to provide, maintain control of the bucket configuration. And so once the bucket was configured properly, Clumio was able to automatically start and pull that data. And then when we actually started doing the backup, we were able to back up all 26 billion records, 800 terabytes, in less than a week. Ironically, Clumio has some scalability or scale protections where they make sure that they don't pull too much data to impact you. So this could have gone faster, but we kept trying to tell Clumio to go faster. But they're like, no, we don't want to hurt you. And then, working with Clumio, the nice part of working with them as a vendor was that they really understand the space and they listen to customers. So when we started looking at all the different features and the capabilities, exactly what it was doing, we're in the scale of billions. And a lot of times, usually you're hearing about millions. So usually between millions and billions, there's a kind of a different, there's different things you have to think about. So one of the things we came across was that when Clumio did the restores, they would add 2 tags to every object to indicate that this was a restored object and this was the timestamp, to give you kind of information so you knew these objects were restored from Clumio and they weren't original to the bucket. However, you couldn't do a restore without them. And when we talked with Clumio, we explained that if we were going to do that restore with the 26 billion records, that's going to cost us $52,000 because of S3 tagging costs, and then another $52,000 to remove those tags. So they were able to make a change actually within a couple days to make those optional. And another way that we're able to fine-tune and help the cost was with the continuous backup, which is with the event bridge where we get the 15-minute RPO. All the objects are replicated, both the creates and the deletes, the puts and deletes. Well, for our use case, we didn't need the deletes to be within the 15-minute RPO based on our architecture. And we could just let the incremental that every night they validate everything that's there and should be there. So we could just let that do the deletes. So they were able to make changes so we could specify we only wanted puts to be under the 15-minute RPO for continuous backup. And that was actually a 48% cost reduction on our side. And then when we integrate with CloudFront, ironically, actually, when we started talking with Clumio, the instant access feature, they explained it, and it was awesome. We're like, this is great. This is exactly what we need. And we said, great, we can use it with CloudFront, right? And they're like, what do you mean use it with CloudFront? It wasn't even on their roadmap. They were just using it as an S3 endpoint. And so we said, look, for a business, to be able to recover the data in hours, all the data, while we're still trying to copy the data, that's priceless. So is there any way that you can actually get CloudFront integration to work with this in the way that you're designing it? So they actually went back to the drawing board, and for the GA release, they were able to work in CloudFront features to work with that. So now we're able to get our data restored, basically the entire data lake in under 3 hours if we ever lost it. So what are other ways that people are using instant access outside of CloudFront?
Yeah, so the whole idea of instant access came from our obsession to actually reduce the RTO and then the cost aspects of it. Obviously, one of the use cases that we talked about is how it reduces your RTO. But then the original use case that we had that people have using is for things like DR testing. So if you have a bucket, a production bucket, and you're backing it up, and if you have to do a DR test every quarter, what does that mean? Do you have to restore hundreds of millions of objects into a final location so that you point your DR application to it, so that you do a quick test and you destroy the bucket? But that's a lot of waste of time and resources, because restoring hundreds of millions in billions sometimes is cost prohibitive. So what we wanted to do is enable that use case to allow you to quickly go back in time and stood up an S3 bucket where you can point and quickly test as a test dev or a DR test, where you can actually test at a fraction of the cost and also a fraction in terms of even the time. That's one use case that we heard. Obviously, it was a pleasure, working with Mark, very technical team, and then the CloudFront feedback was great, so we act on it immediately. Yep. And some of the other requests that we're getting in things like, can you guys integrate this with, let's say, AWS Athena? If you want to take the data lake back to, let's say, my example, back to yesterday at 5 p.m., and you want to do it really quick, and you want to do a quick Athena query by hooking it up directly, well, that's going to be another use case that you can integrate with instant access. Right. All right. So net, where in terms of scale, I think where we can process, I believe, 10 million objects every hour, give and take. Yep. That's kind of what you guys are doing.
Yep.
And then the restore is for the 30 billion. It is taking about 3 hours to restore 30 billion objects.
30 billion.
30 billion.
Yep.
All right. Fast point time clones. All right, so that's pretty much it. And then now, thank you for stopping by. We're at the booth. It's right there, booth 605. Thank you.
Thank you.